Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Intro to the Affordability Crisis, Intro to Tech Equity webinar. I hope you all can hear and see me. We're going to get started in just a couple of minutes as we wait for the room to fill. So introduce yourselves in the chat if you'd like. Like I said, we'll get started in about a minute or two, and I'll repeat this message about one or two more times. So thanks for being here. We'll get started shortly. Hello to those of you just joining us. We're going to get started in just a couple of minutes. We're just waiting for the room to fill in a bit. Introduce yourselves in the chat if you'd like. Grab some water. Get your food if you have any. We'll get started in about a minute, and I'll repeat this message a couple more times, so apologies if you hear it more than once. Welcome to those of you just joining us. We're going to get started in a couple of minutes. We're just waiting for the room to fill. I'll repeat this message about one or two more times, and then we'll get started. Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started. I want to thank you all for joining us today. I hope you all can hear and see me. My name is Calderon. I'm the community manager at TechEquity Collaborative. So in my role, I get to engage with our supporters and our volunteers through campaigns that we participate in throughout the year and through events such as these. And so as we go through the presentation, feel free to drop in questions into the Q&A function at the bottom of your screens, but we won't answer any of the questions until the end of the presentation. The presentation is also being recorded and will be sent out to you afterwards. If you have any, if you want to share that with someone, or if you want to share the slides with anyone, that will be at the end of the presentation. So a little bit about what we're covering today. We're talking about why Tech Equity, our organization, why we exist as an organization, how we got started. We'll talk about the key issues we've identified to help us understand the problems that need to be solved. And we'll talk about how we can take action to some of these pressing economic issues. So why are we here? Well, as an organization, Tech Equity got started because some of its founders and early members saw symptoms of growing inequity within their neighborhoods. And they understood that there was this perception that tech and tech workers were the cause of this problem. So they noticed things around them, such as rising rents, displacement, increases in traffic, and an increase in people experiencing homelessness. And as they talked to others, they realized that they weren't alone in their concerns and that they, as tech workers, were uniquely positioned to help contribute to some of these solutions. And especially now in the face of the pandemic, we're seeing that the affordability crisis gets so much worse with an increased burden placed on lower income people and communities of color. And many of our neighbors are uncertain as to how they'll continue to manage what was already an untenable situation. And at the same time, tech workers have remained relatively unscathed. And as a result, the pandemic has the potential to further exacerbate some of this equality in our region that some of our early founders were already seeing. And because of this affordability crisis, communities are frustrated, and it really comes to no surprise. I know for myself, I've grown up in the Bay Area my whole life, and I've kind of been able to see both sides of the coin, right? I'm not sure if any of you are from the Bay Area, but I think it's a pretty similar story where we have friends and family who are concerned about, their living situations, job security, and the changes that they're seeing in their community, and what that means for themselves, but also having friends and family who at the same time are pursuing jobs within the tech industry and are, finding a lot of success for themselves and their families alike. And however, we see that when tech is shouldering the blame for some of these issues, it starts to create this us versus them dynamic that's only further dividing our communities. And we know that tech workers care and that they want to help and that they don't want to contribute to this deepening divide within our region. And while we're all unsure as to how long we'll be managing this new normal that was caused by the pandemic, right? We're 2 years in. It's important to note that many in the tech sector have remained relatively unscathed because more than most other sectors, tech was able to make the transition to working from home with little to no disruption. And now more than ever, tech workers and tech companies have an opportunity to support more equitable solutions in our communities. And we have an opportunity to use our unique positions of privilege to support our neighbors, but it can be hard to know how to best engage in times of such uncertainty, how to best engage in our communities, and how to best engage in with some of these problems that feel so large, right? And so this is the state of our affordability crisis in the Bay Area. The fact that rents are rising, I don't think is a surprise to anyone on this call because we know this, we feel this either personally or we've heard this from friends and family. And while some Californians are very successful in the tech-driven economy here, the average salaries for tenants have actually decreased slightly throughout the years. And we're showing stats for California because that's where TechEquity is based and is headquartered, but a version of the story is playing out all across the country. And it really is a sharp contrast with the narrative of tech success and without tech at the table to work together to address our shared crisis. It's understandable as to why community members are frustrated, like we just talked about. And just to put it a little bit more in perspective with the pandemic, before the pandemic, unemployment was hovering just around 4%, and people were already struggling to make ends meet. And when the virus hit, unemployment claims had spiked to 16%, which is a more drastic spike than our last recession we had in 2008. So in the span of a month, we lost about a decade's worth of recovery. And as instability and uncertainty continues, we'll see more of our neighbors being pushed into homelessness or worse. At TechEquity, we're as optimistic as ever about the tech industry's potential to drive broad-based growth that's accessible to everyone, but it's clear that it's not going to happen on its own. We have to invest in the people and the institutions that are serving our communities, and we personally have to show up, right? We have to do so in partnership with those in the community that are feeling the most pain if we're to dismantle this notion that tech is the enemy. We believe that a more engaged tech sector is a more ethical tech sector, that connecting tech workers and companies to the issues where they live in will result in more ethical decisions at work and more engagement in our communities. And we know we can do this. And the first step is to show up. And y'all have done a great first step, by signing on to this webinar today to get to learn a little bit more about the facts and then how you can plug in. So our goal at TechEquity is to change the conditions in which the tech sector is growing. We believe that effective structural change will eliminate a culture and policies that have institutionalized inequity, leading to stronger and more resilient communities. And we help tech workers approach these, really big problems and engage in system change in three major ways. So our programs educate you about the most critical civic issues where you live. And we do this in a variety of ways. We host book club discussions, panel discussions with experts. We host webinars such as the one you're on today. We produce voter guides around voter season, blog posts that are educational, really just a lot of different ways and channels to educate our base. We also advocate for public policy that rebalances power and economic equity. And a perfect example of that was in 2019, when we worked in a coalition alongside community members, legislative stakeholders, community-based organizations to push forward the Tenant Protection Act of 2019, which now extends protections to over 8 million California renters, preventing unjust evictions and price gouging of rents. And finally, there's corporate practice, aiming to turn companies into agents of equity in the broader community. And we have corporate partnerships and engagements with different companies. And tech workers have this outsized political power that is largely untapped to when it comes to public policy advocacy. And connecting tech workers to outside perspectives, not only it builds more empathy and ethical practices in our workplaces, in our products, and in our surrounding communities. At TechEquity, our two key issue areas are housing and workforce and labor. So while housing costs are a core part of the issues many people in our community are facing, these two issues really are intertwined and intersect in a variety of ways, because where you live affects your access to opportunity, and what job you have affects where you're able to afford to live. Our goal at TechEquity is bold, comprehensive change by companies and government that's led by the tech workforce. And these issues have only gotten more urgent in the face of the pandemic, but we're all well positioned to adapt our agenda to these new realities. And so let's dive into a little bit more about the history of the affordability crisis. So the affordability crisis is decades in the making. The policy choices that we've made over the course of decades has set us up for this level of pain that our community is feeling now. And so in the 1930s, the federal government instituted a policy that's still felt today, especially by communities of color in the Bay Area, in California, and all across the country. And that policy is redlining. So redlining was a process in which the Homeowners Loan Corporation, a federal agency, gave neighborhoods ratings to guide investment. And the policy is also named for the red or hazardous neighborhoods that were deemed riskiest. So on maps, those neighborhoods were literally redlined. As we can see with the image of the screen, that is a redlined map of San Francisco. So all those red blocks you see on your screen are examples of historically redlined neighborhoods. And those communities that were deemed risky for investment didn't receive any investment at all. And these neighborhoods were predominantly home to communities of color. That really is by no accident that hazardous ratings were in large part due to based on racial demographics. So in other words, redlining was a discriminatory policy and a racist policy, and it made it hard for residents to get loans for home ownership or maintenance of their homes for something like building a new roof. And consequently, redlining led to cycles of disinvestment, including development and production within these neighborhoods. So there's a terrible history of underinvestment, underbuilding, and exclusion in our country. And often those communities that have been historically underinvested in and have been redlined are the very same communities that are at risk of gentrification today. So the crisis we're living in is decades in the making, way before tech, and it's not unique to the Bay Area. It extends across California and across the country. So these are examples of red-line neighborhoods in Austin and Atlanta, two up-and-coming tech hubs in the country. So on the left side, we have a map of Austin, and on the right side, we have a map of Atlanta. And once again, all those red blocks you're seeing are examples of historically red-line neighborhoods within both cities. So by preventing entire neighborhoods from being able to access this capital, these neighborhoods were unable to build the schools that they needed, small businesses, and a community that really fostered economic success and opportunity. And it caused many of the people who lived in red line neighborhoods for generations to fall in and stay in liquid asset poverty. Now, you may be asking yourselves, what is liquid asset poverty? Well, someone is considered to be in liquid asset poverty if they don't have enough savings to cover their basic expenses for 3 months after experiencing an income shock. And an income shock could be something like a huge rent increase. You suddenly lose your job, or maybe your car breaks down and it's going to cost a lot of money to fix it. And it impacts almost 1 out of 3 Californians. So 33.9% of Californians are in liquid asset poverty, and people of color and lower income people are affected at much higher rates, with 41.2% of African American households in liquid asset poverty and 56.2% of Latino households living in liquid asset poverty. And there really isn't a single reason as to why this is happening. Many years of policy decisions have led to these outcomes, which are especially burdensome for communities of color. And these policy decisions have often predated tech's arrival, like we talked about, but tech workers can now take a role in supporting better policies moving forward. And the twin forces of a housing shortage, particularly with affordable housing and wages that don't cover the cost of living, have created this regional crisis that has hindered opportunity, growth, and prosperity for families and businesses alike. And as you can imagine, these statistics will likely be impacted by the outcomes of the pandemic. Many people in our communities were already struggling. And as pandemic recovery continues to be starkly uneven and unequal, many of our neighbors are facing increased instability and likely will for years to come if we don't implement the necessary solutions now. As we can see, the hourly pay for workers has also not increased much the last couple of decades, even though productivity has dramatically increased. So according to the Economic Policy Institute, the share of workers covered by a collective bargaining agreement or unions dropped from 27% to 11.6% between 1979 and 2019, meaning that the union coverage rate is now less than half where it was 40 years ago. And this means that employees have less bargaining power to advocate for pay rates in alignment with the work that they're delivering. And while all workers have lost out because of this, Black, Indigenous, and people of color are the most impacted. And while there's a gap between worker pay and productivity, like we just talked about, there's also a pay gap between race. White men are earning more cents to the dollar, that's that orange bar on the left, in comparison to Black men and women, the blue bars on the right. And because Black, Indigenous, and people of color are getting paid less and disproportionately, they're not able to afford living in the cities that provide good jobs. And the cost of living here were already high. So let's take a look at what a worker earning minimum wage fares in the current rental market. So this is what it takes to afford an average 2-bedroom apartment in San Francisco. So if you're making $133,000 a year, you can afford the average 2-bedroom working a regular 8-hour day, 5 days a week. However, if you're making minimum wage, you need to work 40 hours a day to afford that 2-bedroom. Again, if you're making minimum wage in San Francisco, you need to work 40 hours a day to afford that 2-bedroom. So there's only 24 hours in a day. So we're actually setting up an impossible situation for low-wage workers to be able to afford living in the city where they work in. And the problem persists all across the country. So even though costs in up-and-coming tech cities like Austin, Denver, and Atlanta aren't as high as San Francisco, the cost of living is still unreasonable for anyone that's earning minimum wage. And in San Francisco, it's not just people outside the tech sector that are struggling to afford the city. There's this common misconception that all tech workers are paid these lavish salaries. However, not every salaried employee is making 6 figures. And some salaried tech employees, like those in customer success or marketing, are paid salaries that are still considered to be low income in the Bay Area. And even further away from the image of a wealthy tech worker are the thousands of contractors and contingent workers like security guards, custodians, cooks, bus drivers, who are working long hours to maintain tech companies, but are receiving minimum benefits and are not paid as much. So you have to have a good salary to afford your apartment, but why is your apartment so expensive to begin with? Well, rents are going up due in part to lack of supply, and this chart is showing us what we should be building. So the state sets goals for how much housing local communities should build to keep up with demand and population growth. And these are called RHNA goals, RHNA, and that stands for Regional Housing Needs Allocation. And as we can see, we're doing a pretty good job at meeting our RHNA goal for the above moderate income housing bracket. That's that big blue bar on the right side of your screen. And that's affordable to people making a good salary, like we just talked about. But we're not building anywhere close enough housing for lower and moderate income people. Those are the 2 red bars on the left side of the screen. As housing costs have skyrocketed with production of affordable housing not being matched, working class residents and communities of color have been driven out of our urban core and pushed into the outer edges of our regions, further away from job centers and supportive services. And some residents have been displaced from the region altogether. So remember when someone tells you that we just need to build more housing, ask them, build more housing for whom? Again, we're not building enough housing at lower levels of affordability. And because we're not building enough housing that's affordable for lower and middle income people, they're leaving our communities while folks with higher incomes are coming in and staying in. And this chart is showing us how people in lower incomes, the orange bars, have left San Francisco at higher rates, while people with higher incomes have increased migration into the city. And people beneath 30% AMI are in a more drastic situation where they can't even afford to leave San Francisco as they're getting pushed into homelessness or worse. So that's actually why that last blue bar is increasing, is because there's not enough affordable housing available to help support the most vulnerable members in our community. And amongst people of color, the rates of displacement are, equally as tragic. As we talked about earlier, Black and Latino populations are amongst the highest living in liquid asset poverty, are leaving San Francisco at higher rates over the past couple of years. So a combination of discriminatory housing laws, low wages, a lack of affordable housing production have really created this crisis of displacement. And so displacement is driven by policy choices, and we may see this ratio of displacement continue to rise as the pandemic continues to progress. The folks that are the most rent burdened were the ones in low wage jobs, and low wage jobs were the ones that got hit the hardest during the beginning of the pandemic 2 years ago. And we can't build our way out to solve our problems, but it is true that we don't have enough homes for people. And the good news is that, we have members at TechEquity that are showing up for the community. Tech workers are also members of the community and should be at the table working together alongside non-tech community members. And together we can advocate for solutions to our most pressing shared problems. And we have to work together to address, these underlying issues that are driving inequity within our tech economy. So as you can see, the affordability crisis we're living out today is the result of years and years of bad policy choices. But the good news is that we can make a different set of choices moving forward. At TechEquity, we envision a world where a growing tech-driven economy creates opportunity for everyone, and where tech sector employees and companies are engaged and active participants in making our communities a better place to live. And so we've identified structural changes that need to happen in order to achieve this vision, but we won't be able to achieve it without the necessary policy changes. And here's what we've identified in the housing world. So we need to take an above all approach to tackling our housing affordability crisis, and that starts with production. What is production? Well, production, building more housing, specifically at lower levels of affordability. And we can do this through zoning and permitting reform that brings down the cost of constructing housing by removing delays and lengthy administrative processes that just make it too expensive to build homes here. Preservation, making sure we're providing more resources to subsidize and maintain and improve existing affordable housing. Protection, we need to protect existing tenants from displacement. So it's going to take a while, right, for us to build the amount of housing that we need. So in the meantime, we need to make sure that existing tenants, are protected from displacement. Racial equity. Racism is embedded in our economic, political, social systems. It's embedded in us all, and especially embedded in housing. And that means that we have to be explicit about how racism and racial bias are upheld in housing. So we have to craft policy solutions that are building racial equity in response as well. And especially now, we need to be thinking about short and long-term solutions to preservation and protection, because like we've been talking about, many of our neighbors are more at risk now than ever as a result of what the last 2 years has brought us. We also need to make sure that we all get enough compensation and benefits to live a healthy and stable life. We want to ensure that companies are doing their part to contribute to the communities that they exist within, that people in the surrounding communities are able to access these jobs, and that these jobs are paying fair wages and benefits regardless of the role. And we need to make sure that all workers are protected. Within the tech sector, we see large disparities emerging between headquarters, warehouse workers, and contracted workers. So in partnership with Silicon Valley Rising, we created this standard that tech companies should implement for contract workers, which includes creating space for workers to have a voice, providing career mobility opportunities, good wages and benefits, making sure the workplace is safe, and ensuring that there's fair scheduling. We need to expand and equip the workforce. Training as a standalone approach is not going to lead us out of inequality, and it's not going to guarantee employment for most displaced workers. So in order to solve this crisis, we have to undertake multiple strategies, right? Massive job programs, higher labor standards and protections for all jobs, and innovative recruitment, training, and development of new and diverse talent. At the same time, the tech industry has an imperative to make its employee base more representative of the population at large, not just to create broader economic opportunity, but because companies with diverse representation at all levels are more likely to be successful than those that aren't. And last, we need to make sure that everyone's basic needs are met. We need a new social contract that ensures that everyone has the basics to survive. And we must strengthen our social safety net so that no one falls through the cracks. So once again, there are tons of ways for you to get involved with TechEquity Collaborative. As I mentioned, we host tons of educational and social events. If you're interested in public policy, every year we have a set of priority legislation for us. Those are just bills that we're tracking that we like to support and work on, hopefully get passed around housing in the labor space. I'll be talking about one of those shortly. And for corporate practice, if you're interested in involving your company, we offer a wide range of services for companies and provide them ways to get involved, from employee engagement to policy advising. So this is how we work. We try to make it as accessible and as easy as possible to plug in, but also making sure that we're building community in the progress with whatever we do. So this year, 2022, we really had a bunch of different key initiatives, and it really started with the Contract Worker Disparity Project, which was a first of its kind worker-centered initiative that shed the light on the practice of contracting out and proposed and advocated for public policy solutions and partnered with companies to adopt responsible contracting practices. We also had the Tech Bias in Housing Initiative, which examines the promises and perils of housing technology, aiming to ensure that technological innovations in the housing space do not reinforce the racist housing systems and policies of the past, like we talked about earlier in the presentation. Passing economic justice policy. As I was just mentioning, every year we introduce a bold policy agenda that addresses economic inequality in the housing market and in the workplace. And our priorities this year were around housing data transparency, equitable labor standards, data surveillance protections, and more. And finally, the System Reset Initiative, which was helping tech companies create on-ramps for people returning from incarceration, and we partnered with justice involved people and organizations to get a system reset into every tech company in California. So what can you do? You can do 3 things right after you get off this webinar. You can tell a friend about our work. The more people know about us, the better. You can sign up for a community conversation, which is really just a one-on-one with me where, we get to know each other on a more personal level. I can actually see you. But also I can answer any questions, talk about how do you like to get more further involved. And I host those all throughout the year. So if you're, ever interested in, just talking to someone from TechEquity, reply to the email that we're sending out afterwards. And I'd, love to hop down and sit with you for 30 minutes and just talk about, how we can help each other out. And finally, you can take action with us by becoming a volunteer. Like I said, we have a variety of campaigns, but we also have civic tech projects that are going on throughout the year. So if that's something of interest, please reply to that email. The one piece of priority legislation I did want to highlight from this year is the Pay Transparency for Pay Equity Act, or SB 1162. SB just means Senate bill here in California. And, we had volunteers call into committee meetings to voice their statements of support, sign petitions online, call their legislators, and it ensured that companies created a fair and equal playing field for all workers by posting salaries in the job description and posting promotional opportunities to their existing employees before selecting a candidate. So this was actually passed this year. It's something that we started from scratch, with a coalition, legislative stakeholders, like I said, as the bill was moving throughout the California houses, the Assembly and the Senate. We were able to have tech equity volunteers, members, people from our base, really tech workers, voice their support for bringing more transparency in the workforce as a law. And so it was successfully, signed by the governor this year. And so it's like, if you want to be a part of cool things like this, and crucial work that needs to happen like this, like I said, reach out to me to see how we can plug you in for next year's policy agenda. And so on events, we don't have, this is, I guess, the last event of the year for us. So thank you for being here. We just had an event yesterday around tech layoffs. I'm pretty sure many of you have heard about the layoffs that have been happening these last couple of weeks. And so we had an event yesterday, just kind of talking about what that means for the tech workforce. And so if you'd like to watch that, I'll be sending out a link to our events page, and the recording is already on our website. But we always host events, so tune in back in January to see what we're up to next. So like I said, you can do 3 things right after you get off this call. You can tell a friend about our work, sign up for a community conversation, or, sign up to volunteer, reach out to me, like I said. So now I'll take a minute for questions. If anyone has some, it's okay if you don't. As I mentioned, I'll be sending out a follow-up email with a link to the presentation, a link to the recording. Feel free to share that, save that. And like I said, reply to that email if you have questions later, if you'd like to, find out about upcoming opportunities, if you'd like to sit down with me one-on-one. I'm always happy to chat. Cool. Not seeing any questions, totally fine. I want to thank you all for your time. We hope you feel inspired to join, our movement. We hope to see you at a future event, volunteer opportunity, one-on-one, whatever it be. Like I said, if you're curious about anything we're working on, email me. I can respond back to emails pretty fast. We can set up time to talk. Always happy to, talk to our base. So you should get that email in about an hour or two. Like I said, respond back to that email if you like. Thank you all, and hope you enjoy your weekends.